Good evening, everybody. As we have a very tight schedule to make sure that we finish at a reasonable hour, we always start on time. So it's very good of you to be here with us. And it's a great pleasure to see so many of you. Personality. I was just discussing with a couple of the presenters beforehand. The word itself is a very difficult, complex word, is it not? And we were trying to find the Hebrew equivalent, and we actually couldn't. You would think that in every language there is a translation. Not necessarily so, because a language is always a cultural iteration of some basic notion. And English being such a complex language, I always call it a bastard language because it's made up of so many antecedents of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Roman, Greek, Romance languages and the like. We're talking, therefore, usually in a very complex manner, and that's why I can give a whole lecture in English and not share almost any information whatsoever. That's intelligible, that is. Nevertheless, I'm hoping this evening we will make it intelligible. Whatever the word personality is, and you'll get a number of different nuances this evening as to what it is, it's got to do with something very, very basic within. But at the very same time, it has a connotation of evolution, development. Some people believe that personality is a fixed item that is not subject to any change whatsoever. It's got to do with your most intrinsic aspect of self, genetics, childhood's formative circumstances, culture, and the like. And others believe that it's an evolving work in progress, that you have a level of control. So you have the variation from all the way on the left, fixed, right through to every day I'm a different person. And we're going to have different facets of that. And we will conclude somewhere to the end with one proposition or the other. I'm very, very glad to have a top-notch set of presenters tonight. And I'll introduce them one by one. And the first one is someone who's not unknown to us for a number of reasons, Dr. Debbie Herbst. And you have heard Debbie a number of times before, and also probably seen her as a film star in a documentary or two now in terms of sugar and addiction and its effect on us. Debbie has been working at the Inkerman Medical Clinic since 1995 and has been a partner there since 2000. As well as being a busy mother and now grandmother, Dr. Debbie focuses on health and well-being of all her patients through emphasis on a healthy lifestyle. Her main interests are women and children's health, as well as diet and nutrition, especially the impact of eating and the style of eating when in pregnancy and beyond. She's very much a proponent of emerging trends in nutrition that focus on less consumption of processed foods, refined sugars and starches. In 2013, she was involved in the making of the movie The Sugar Film, and there has been a sequel, has there not, Debbie? Yes. Dr. Debbie is accredited through Royal Women's Hospital as a shared care GP to deliver top quality care prior to conception, throughout pregnancy and after delivery. And quite another dimension of Debbie, she happens to be the beloved mother-in-law to our director, Rabbi Menachem Wolf. On that basis, Debbie, I invite you to come and join us and share with us some aspects of to what extent does personality become affected by some of the foods or toxicity more specifically, and perhaps affecting our moods and behaviors at the same time. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Laibl. Thank you very much for the introduction. I was just thinking this must be the ultimate way to punish your mother-in-law. Get back at your mother-in-law is not that I know. I always enjoy speaking at Spiritgrow, so it's by far a punishment. today, as some of you may be aware, is in the Hebrew, in the Jewish calendar, Purim Katan, what's called the small Purim. 1 month from now, it will be Purim. The reason that there's a Purim Katan, a small Purim, is that this is there's a leap year in our calendar this year. So the month of Adar appears twice. We're now in the first of the Adar, Aleph, and we celebrate Purim in the second Adar, so exactly a month from now. So I was just thinking, in the spirit of Purim, because we actually learned that everything that we do on Purim, we should be doing on Purim Katan, other than hearing the Megillah and giving gifts to our friends. But the spirit of the day is something that we should be enjoying now. So I couldn't really think of a joke. I'm not very good at telling jokes, but I just thought, 2 doctors, 2 psychologists and a rabbi are all in a room together. I don't know. We'll all take where we want. And deciding... so that's what we have tonight. I'm not so much going to touch on personality. I'm going to leave that to my other colleagues. Laibl did ask me, and I scratched my head a little bit trying to find the connection between what we eat and personality, although really it's going to come down to how we define what personality really is. What I'm going to speak about tonight is, as it says, the effects of what we eat on our behaviour, mood and mental well-being. It sort of occurred to me, do we ever connect the dots between what's on our plates and our mental, physical, emotional and spiritual well-being? Or do we just sort of look at food, and this is something I've talked about before, as being fuel? Do we look at ourselves as being, food is just calories and it's energy, and we need to give energy to our bodies to be able to do what we want to do, and therefore food is just fuel? And for too long, I think certainly the medical establishment and dietitians just saw, well, it's just a matter of calories, and you just need to fuel your body, and calories in and calories out. You need to move, you need to exercise, and you need to eat to sustain all of this. So really, what difference does it make? I remember years ago people said, without wanting to name any organisations, well, it doesn't matter if you eat your 2,000 calories worth of broccoli or 2,000 calories worth of chocolate. Really, it's just about getting the calories in. But then, as Craig and I were discussing before, and even I sort of came up with the idea, our bodies are not a car. In cars, people pay more attention sometimes and do more research into what the best fuel and what type of fuel they put into their car than think about and put into practice what they do with their bodies. So I just thought it's sort of a useful thing to think about, that calories are not just calories and food is much more than just fuel. So I'm starting with what I want the take-home message to be today, and this is my take-home message probably from just about every talk that I do, but these really are sort of the 5 golden rules that we talk about in health, well-being, mental health, physical health. Cut back, as Laibl said, on sugars, cut back on processed sugars. I'm not going to have time to go into detail with all these. I've spoke about them before, and happy to speak about them at length on another occasion, on any occasion actually, if you want to engage me in it. So cutting back on sugars, avoiding vegetable oils, eating real food. We'll talk about that a little bit. Avoiding processed foods and food-like substances. Something that is called a food-like product is not food. It's artificial, it's manufactured, it comes in a box, it sits in the supermarket on a shelf that can last for years and years. That is not food. It's a food-like substance that we've all unfortunately come to be sold on, and we should all be drinking water, especially when we're thirsty. So what's the common denominators between these sort of things that I spoke about that we need to cut back on? In general, overconsumption of sugars and processed food contribute to increased insulin levels. People know about insulin from diabetes, but insulin is a lot more involved in our bodies just than in the role of control of diabetes. They contribute to and cause inflammation, inflammatory damage in the body, eating too much sugars and carbohydrates and overconsumption of vegetable oils, and they also have an effect on the gut microbiome. Anyone who's heard my previous talks, this isn't something we've gone to before, but we will touch on today. So the don'ts are easy. So on that graph on the left, so in the between the 1960s and the 1990s, all these things have been on the increase: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and in line with that is our consumption of sugar. The red, the bottom line, has increased exponentially. We can also add in their mental health disorders, behavioural issues, learning problems, attention deficit disorder. autism spectrum disorders have all been, markedly on the increase. Now, some of you will say, oh, that's because of better recognition and, better diagnosis. Some of that is true, but these things have really increased, really exponentially and in line with increased sugar consumption. So in the middle there, the average American and Australians as well, then it's not just Americans, in fact we might be even worse on some things, eats over 30 teaspoons, the equivalent of 30 teaspoons of sugar a day. And that people think about, oh, that's because they drank a can of Coke or because they ate chocolate. Those things do contribute, but it's the hidden sugars in the muesli bars, in the yogurts, in the things that we think we're doing are eating healthy that contain a lot of added sugar, and that's way too much. The World Health Organization recommends no more than 6 to 9 teaspoons of sugar in all the foods that we eat, besides what's found in real foods like fruits and vegetables. And that little picture on the left is on the right is just to remind us that sugar comes in many guises. It's not just the white stuff. Oils, vegetable oils, we really need to consider it. And I love the slide on the my right, your left, fats that are made in factories and are ones to be avoided. Fats that are found in nature in general are the ones that we should be looking at. So switching over back to all the things that our grandparents used to eat and we've been told are really bad for us. Butter, animal fats, coconut was demonised for many, many years. And we were led to believe that in the sort of the 60s and 70s, if everyone just, we can have all of these sort of polyunsaturated, man-made, created, manufactured fats and we'll lower cholesterol and we'll cure heart disease forever and we'll all be good. I don't know if anyone saw the wraparound in the Sun on the weekend. Anyone to see the wraparound? I think on the Sunday Herald Sun, it had something about, learn more about the serial killer, 51 deaths a day. And what it was, I thought it was quite clever because it really captured your attention. 51 deaths a day in Australia due to heart disease, and they're on a campaign now about awareness and people should get checkups, and yeah, that's all fantastic, but we've got to ask the question, if the advice that we've been given for the last 30 or 40 years is correct and right, then why does heart disease continue to be such a problem? Either are we all stupid, we don't listen to the advice, or maybe the advice that we've been given is wrong. You can think about that. We're not all so stupid and, just non-compliant. So the do's, and I really like this because I like to keep things really, really simple. In 1903, Thomas Edison famously said, the doctor of the future will no longer treat the human frame with drugs, but rather will cure and prevent disease with nutrition. So this is back in the beginning of 1903, Thomas Edison said this. And what's happened in intervening 100 and something years is that drug companies, food manufacturers, governments, politics have intervened in the way and we've really lost the way. We don't eat like this. I mean, we do eat like that, but we've really messed things up a lot. And we need to get back to basics and to take that this quote very much to heart. Just on a side thing, sort of fitting in with this, a patient actually told me, and I didn't have time to look it up, that a number of years ago when the whole cholesterol thing was, coming out, cholesterol, and I actually remember as a very, very young doctor starting out when the drug rep came to talk to me about the very first statin drug, the one that's supposed to save the world, save all of us, came out and I said, this is fantastic, we just put it in the water and no one will ever get heart disease anymore and everyone will live to 120, happy, healthy, long years, no one, anyway. And anyway, so apparently at that time, this is in the late 80s, early 90s, that there was also a push at that time that people should get screened. Some of you have probably heard of what's called a coronary calcium score to see if the coronary arteries actually have a build-up of anything in them. And they lost the battle to the statin drugs because the statin drugs obviously were being manufactured and marketed by drug companies who have lots of money behind them, and this push to get more generalised screening for coronary calcium scores cost a lot of money. No one wanted to put the money into it, and now we're 30, 40 years down the track and they're just coming into a little bit common that maybe this is the way that we should be going and not looking at a number on a piece of paper and giving a person a tablet in a box every day. So what does the science actually tell us? It's all very nice, all this stuff, but we're going back now to brain function. And there are studies done looking at the relationship between food intake and brain function and mental health, although some of them in relation to mental health disease and diet, they're a bit hard to conduct. Craig just reminded there is some research being done in Melbourne on the relationship, the connection between food and mood, and I guess watch this space. But a lot of the research, or the sort of the hard data that no one will dispute, is the evidence that comes out of the research being done, that has been done, and it's not new, it's been known for many, many years, about that putting certain people with certain neurological conditions on what's called the ketogenic diet is very, very effective in treating these people. I have had a number of patients in my practice, small children who have had intractable epilepsy with frequent seizures, going back to the hospitals and the doctors, getting put on higher and higher doses of medication and more medication, until finally someone says, you know what, let's try your child on a ketogenic diet. Now, of course, at first it sounds very restrictive to the parents, and it can be, and it is when children are off at birthday parties and all sorts of other things. But the results that they see when they put these children on these diets are absolutely astounding. And in some cases, children are able to get off medication. So no one will doubt this, no one will disagree or dispute this. And there are a number of, very notable neurologists in Melbourne who are exponents of this, but they'll stop there. They'll say, oh yeah, well, that's true, that works in epilepsy, and we've got all the research to show it. But if you start to ask them, well, what do you think then about the effect of food and the diet on other neurological or brain conditions? Oh, no, well, we don't know. So, you can't extrapolate. Now, there is also evidence emerging PD as Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, ALS, or motor neurone disease, people with chronic headaches, as well as in metabolic disorders. We have a lot of hard evidence about the relationship with food. And then we said, like I said, what about psychiatric disorders? What about psychiatric disease? What about Alzheimer's? What about mood disorders and ADD, attention deficit disorder? Where is the evidence that a ketogenic diet in particular, but modifying the diet and reducing the intake of those inflammatory foods that we spoke about in the beginning will actually help? Alzheimer's disease, by the way, is now in some circles called type 3 diabetes. In other words, there's a clear link between people with diabetes, with metabolic syndrome, with heightened insulin levels for much of their life, and developing Alzheimer's disease. Again, a lot of everyone will accept, because the data is in, that people with poorly controlled diabetes, type 2 diabetes, who have Alzheimer's, will do a lot worse than those where the diabetes is better controlled. So people will say, oh yes, when you keep a tighter sugar control in these people, yes, we'll agree that helps Alzheimer's. But we really need to go to the next step for people to look at, well, perhaps we can prevent a lot of Alzheimer's disease. Perhaps we can prevent some of these mood disorders. Perhaps we can lower back the rate of children presenting with attention deficit disorder and adults presenting with attention deficit disorder. So let's just touch very briefly on what the ketogenic diet is, because there's a lot of myth around it. Is it a realistic diet? Is it something that people can do? And does it stick to the 5 golden rules? Does it fit in with the 5 golden rules that I mentioned in the beginning? So just very, very briefly, ketogenic diet 101. VLCD, so it's what's called a very low carbohydrate diet, less than 20 grams of carbohydrate a day, which have massive effect on lowering blood sugar and insulin levels in the body. So less than 20 grams of carbohydrate basically means you can't eat any, forget about the known carbohydrates, bread, potatoes, sugar, cakes, pastries, pasta, rice, absolute zero of any of that. But it also means even vegetables, so very low carbohydrate vegetables, so things like carrots, things that grow in the ground, vegetables, even though they're vegetables and they're wonderful and have a lot of other fantastic things about them, would be too much carbohydrate. Fruits are very limited. Anyway, why do we bother with this, and what does it do? So we know that when people have very low carbohydrate intake, the body turns to the fat stores and the fat that we eat to fuel our energy, rather than relying on the breakdown of carbohydrates, which turns to sugar or glucose as energy. The brain, 20% of our daily energy intake of the entire body, of the requirements, 20% of that is used by our brain. So this little thing, not such a little thing on the top of our head, uses 20% of, but the rest of our organs and heart and everything else, the brain is using 20%. And the brain obviously needs a lot of fuel to work properly. The brain functions much better, can choose 2 energy sources, glucose from breakdown of carbohydrates, or ketones, which are the breakdown of fats. So the ketones, as it says there, come when they break down of fat to fatty acids, and the brain uses that as a fuel. It is a much more efficient and cleaner form of fuel for our brains than glucose. This whole idea that you have to eat glucose, you have to maintain your glucose level, otherwise you can't concentrate, you can't think, you know, is a myth. I remember Laibl did a water fast, I believe, a number of years ago, and said he's never felt clearer in his life, eating absolutely nothing for 7 days. So it takes a little bit of switching the way that we think, but these are sort of the realities. So the most powerful way to change our brain chemistry is by food, because that's where the chemicals are coming from in the first place. So as I said, we know that people's brains function when you can switch to being a fat burner, and it does take some time. I'm happy to talk to anyone about it later if they're thinking of doing the switch. It takes some time. It doesn't happen overnight. But when you become a fat burner and a ketone fueling your brain and your body with ketones, there are tremendous benefits, and particularly on brain function. So we're not sure, is it because you've lowered your sugar, lowered your insulin, but it's probably a combination of all of them. And it's well proven in many physical conditions. And then down the bottom, what about psychological behaviour? What are the similarities? So just a little picture of the brain, two sides of the brain. We won't go into that. So as I said before, there is there's psychologists here tonight. They can do a much better job. So as I said before, there does seem to be a lot of commonality between epilepsy and mental health disorders. We know that there's a lot going on in the brain that is in common. There's similar pathways, neurotransmitters, in particular this one called the GABA neurotransmitter. We know that the same drugs are used to treat epilepsy, bipolar disorder, a lot of pain conditions. I treat the same drugs. So the conventional medical community accepts that these same neurotransmitters are activated and work and are affected by the drugs. What we need to do is then get more people across to this idea that we should be looking at food. Yes, 2 minutes. So there is studies underway, there is research underway. But again, another take-home message, if you don't believe it, and a lot of people who try it and see how clear you are and how even your moods become. So there are questions. Could changing the brain's fuel help change the malfunctions in its nerve cell firings and neuron excitability, which lead to a lot of brain issues? Very quickly, a word about kombucha and kefir. So Hippocrates, a long time ago, said all disease begins in the gut. And then he also said that any doctor who, who despises the knowledge acquired by the ancient is a fool. In other words, we should go back to what some of the ancients were teaching us, and I think that we'll be mindful to heed that. So a healthy gut means a healthy mind, a healthy body and mind. Very briefly, the gut microbiome, something you're going to be hearing more about. It has the most trillions of cells in it. It's bigger than our humans, more than our human cells. It aids in digestion, breaks down the toxins in the bodies, and we know it has a tremendous effect on the immune system, weight and mood. There are nearly 1 billion neurons in our gut and many immune cells. So the microbiome has a very significant effect, not only on physical things, but also on mental and psychological function. Now, what's the problem with the microbiome? Due to our overindulgence in all those things I said that we need to cut back on the beginning, our microbiome has changed because of poor food choices that we've been made and we've been told that we should be doing. So there's a lot of evidence that if we can change our microbiome back or improve our microbiome, we can really help a lot of things, like down the bottom, asthma, autoimmune disease, inflammatory bowel disease, but importantly, mental and neurological disorders, Parkinson's, anxiety, depression, OCD, and importantly, obesity. One of the doctors I work with is very interested in looking at changing people's microbiome. How do you do that? Do you take a probiotic? Stop the rot. Stop eating those things that I mentioned in the beginning. Stop overconsumption of sugars. All carbohydrates are not the same. And kombucha and kefir, I said that in the beginning. Eat real foods, fermented foods to increase eat like our grandparents. You can take some supplements if you like, but also got to do with the fruit and vegetables that you eat. That's a question for everyone here. What should we eat to ensure optimal brain function? I hope you know the answer by now. Not those ones that promote high insulin and high sugar. We should eat the ones that promote good gut health. Don't eat the ones that lead to inflammation. Eat the ones that enhance our microbiome. Where to from here, and do we have a way out? And I'll leave that to the other speakers.
Brilliant.
Well, there's a number of ways of compressing a 1-hour lecture into 15 minutes. One way is to ensure that you only present 1/4 of the material, and the other one is to speak 4 times as fast. Now, I know that there's a lot there that Debbie said, so you'll be very happy to know that all our lectures eventually after a number of weeks, go up online through the very kind agency of David. And so you'll be able to, at leisure, stop and start Debbie's speech and be able to get all those pearls of wisdom. As I'm going to introduce the next speaker, I hope I'm not stealing his thunder when he mentioned to me initially, when we spoke this evening, that the word persona in Latin means Greek Roman plays, but I actually was looking in, and apparently in Latin also, the word persona means mask. And since Debbie mentioned that today is Purim Katan, and it's an aspect of Purim to somehow disguise ourselves in mask form. And there's a lot of deep meaning behind there. And I think all of us have observed how different people's behavior is when they put on a mask. In fact, perhaps assuming the character that the mask denotes. And maybe we all, therefore, are wearing masks. And maybe that's one of the aspects of Purim, to be able to demask ourselves and come back to the core. Does that mean we come back to our real persona, or are we simply our mask? Associate Professor Craig Hassett is a senior lecturer at the Department of General Practice, where he's been teaching at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels since 1989. He's the coordinator of mindfulness programs at Monash University. He's been instrumental in introducing a variety of innovations into medical education and practice in Australia and overseas, with an emphasis on the application of holistic, integrative, mind-body medicine in medical practice. His teaching, research, and clinical interests include mindfulness-based stress management, mind-body medicine, meditation, health promotion, integrative medicine, and medical ethics. He's regularly invited to speak and run courses in Australia and overseas in health, professional, educational contexts, and just comes back from the Asia Pacific Mindfulness Conference in Auckland. Did I get it right? He was the founding president of the Australian Teachers of Meditation Association, regular media commentator on a variety of health-related subjects, writes regularly for medical journals, and has published 10 books. And I think it's really wonderful because this is not Craig's first appearance here. And the fact that he takes the time to come to Spiritgrow and share with us is all that much more commendable. And I want to personally thank him.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right at the back? I've turned the microphone on, but yeah. So it's always a pleasure to come here, and always a very interested, informed audience, I find. So hopefully I can offer something to the discussion tonight. Yes, persona was a mask that the actor would put on. I mean, you might be stepping into a meeting at work and you put on your stern mask and professional mask. You get home and there's a 2-year-old child there, you take off that mask and you put on another mask that's totally appropriate in that situation and play with the child. And the persona is meant to be something that we adopt to respond to a situation and put it down. But unfortunately, most of the time we get very fixed with our personas, and the mask sort of gets put on and we don't know how to take it off again, or even forget that we can take it off. So I'm certainly one of those people who believes that this is a lot more malleable than we think. There are a lot of things that are taught in medical schools, personas fixed, for example, in psychology, that the brain is wired by childhood and it's wired for life, doesn't change, that your genes are fixed. All of these assumptions and facts are actually being demythed over the years. So let's get into it. I've got a fair bit to cover. A little multiple choice question for you, just a little exam to start off. What did the Thai boys soccer team have that helped them to cope with being trapped in a cave for over 2 weeks? Was it A, 20 packets of Valium? Was it B, free Wi-Fi? Was it C, a 70-inch flat screen TV and a full set of Game of Thrones? Or was it D, a coach who was a meditation teacher? Correct answer is D. I was amazed when they got the camera into that place and found, you know, those kids, how cool and calm and collected they were. And how afterwards, weeks after they got out and they finally let them speak to the press and so on, every one of them described not post-traumatic stress, they described post-traumatic growth. In fact, I wouldn't even call it traumatic. That coach, who was a meditation teacher, really helped them to stay grounded, stay present, to just ride those waves of fear and everything else. And they came out and they said they learned an enormous amount about themselves. They came out as much greater than they were when they went into that cave and got trapped by the rising waters. And so it was certainly a very interesting story, but they spent a lot of time practicing mindfulness forms of meditation. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how changes in personality and nature might happen, for better or for worse, because this can go both ways depending on what we practice in our lives. Old Buddha's saying, we are shaped by our thoughts. We become what we think. All right? What we give our attention to. Because the brain, here's a brain cell connecting with thousands of other brain cells. And every time we think something, do something, behave in a certain way, the circuits in our brain that are activated become reinforced, and other circuits that are not being used get pruned back. But this is not only something you find in the Eastern traditions. So as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. You find the same kind of thing pretty much every one of the world's great wisdom traditions. Maybe a modern neuroscientist, Herbst, and this is neurons that fire together, wire together, which is perhaps one way of saying our understanding of neuroplasticity is our brain will be sculpted according to how we're using it. Now, just to give you a little bit of background research. Now, this is actually from research on rats, but I didn't have rats on a graphic at my computer at home, so you've got bunnies. Is that all right? We've got bunnies here. This is just looking at, in the first week of life, lots of nurture leads to more brain serotonin, the chemical that's associated with happier mood and so on. But that stimulates the brain to make more of a particular enzyme. So it switches on genes in the cells in the brain to make more of enzymes, switch on cortisol receptor production. So that is the enzymes that actually regulate the cortisol, the stress chemical in our brain, get switched on. So the brain is getting finely calibrated to manage the stress response. This leads to a high level of cortisol receptors and being less stress prone. So easy to activate if you're eyeball to eyeball with a 4-metre shark, activate the stress response. When we're not, easier to switch it off. And so you wind up with that much happier bunny. Now, of course, if there's not that kind of thing happening early on, then that doesn't happen, the brain serotonin, this doesn't get switched on, there are less receptors and less of a capacity to regulate those emotional response, the stress response. And there's quite a lot of research to show that the brains of, for example, suicide victims, when looking at it, the changes they see in animals brought up in very stressful environments, the changes that happen in their brain and how they regulate the stress response are very similar to what happens in human beings brought up in very, very stressful environments. The brain is regulated, calibrated for stress response and finding it hard to switch it off, which particularly for males predisposes them to anger and violence and hostility in particular. So women who experience extreme stress, we're not talking about mild stressors, no, not finding a park at the supermarket, we're talking about very significant stressors. The stress chemicals that the woman produces in herself, those stress chemicals can cross the placenta and change the development of the fetal brain. So that can actually have an effect. The mother's stress can affect the development of the brain for the child in the womb, which can predispose the child for further stress and mental health problems in later life. And so there's quite a lot of research around that these days. But we're talking about pretty significant stress here. You know, there's a study of Dutch people in the Second World War, and they looked at women who were pregnant before or during or well after the invasion of Holland during the Second World War. Those who were in the first trimester of pregnancy during the invasion had nearly 3 times the level of schizophrenia in their offspring. And they assume that's because of all the stress chemicals crossing the placenta and affecting the development of the brain. Now, of course, there are real and significant stressors we meet in our lives, but there's also the ones that we generate for ourselves. Now, this is a common medieval nightmare, all right? I don't know if you can tell that, but anyway. I don't know if you've ever had a bad dream like that, but the number of things... Has anybody here ever been awake at 3 in the morning? That's amazing, isn't it, what your mind can just whip up out of thin air. And just what is life throwing at you at 3 in the morning? Well, the chances are that it's a soft mattress, a soft pillow, a warm doona and a quiet room. Can life get any more comfortable than that? And yet in our mind, we could be totally somewhere else, creating stuff in our own imaginations. Now, this produces a wear and tear on our system that's called allostatic load. I won't go into all the health effects of impairing immunity and hardening the arteries, etc., but it damages the brain. The areas of the brain we rely on for learning and making decisions, etc. But there's one bit of the brain that grows, only one. It's called the amygdala. And if our body was a car, that's like a turbocharge button on the dashboard, if you like. That's the turbocharge button in our brain. That is, when we see a threat like a lion or a tiger, it fires off and activates the adrenaline to help us to get out of danger. But if we're activating that stress response all the time, in the middle of the night, during the day, in the traffic, at a red light, it gets bigger and it gets more reactive. We are literally wiring the brain for more stress, making it more likely this is going to keep on happening. Now, this time I won't screw up. I won't. Now, down the bottom it says that Roger screws up. Now, Roger's really not paying very good attention to what he's doing right now. When we're not mindful, when we're not paying attention, present, engaged with where we are and what we're doing, we switch into a different mode called default mode. So default mode's the distracted mode of mind. You might have been at home sometime, your partner's talking, you're kind of looking at them, nodding and grunting in the appropriate places, and then realise you haven't heard a word of what they've been saying for the last 5 minutes. Ever happened to you? Default mode. Students sitting in a class, teachers talking, not hearing a word of what they're saying because the mind's out the window, default mode. Depressive rumination, default mode. Negative self-talk, default mode. Worry about future events, distraction, living in an event in our minds 1,000 times before it's even happened, default mode. So there's a lot of default mental activity in states like anxiety and depression, etc. It's like the patterns that the brain gets into. And we have to have mindfulness, we have to have awareness to even realise what patterns of thinking and response we're even in to be able to make a choice about dealing with them. Now, there's a whole lot of text on this particular slide, and I'll just show you tell you what this study was about. So you don't need to look at the text, I'll let you know. This was a study where they looked at children in 1st and 2nd grade at school, and they looked at whether or not their parents were anxious about maths, right, and performed poorly in maths, and how did they correlate with their children's maths anxiety and performance. Now, surprise, surprise, they found a strong correlation between parents who are anxious about maths and perform poorly and children who perform poorly and were anxious about maths, but only if the parent regularly helped the child with their maths homework. If a parent was anxious about maths and didn't help their child with the maths homework, the child was fine at maths. The parent thought they were trying to teach the child about maths. What they were doing was modelling how to be anxious about maths. And the child who's 6 or so will pick up that lesson like a flash. Oh, mummy or daddy, how do I behave when you put numbers in front of me? I'll show you. I'll put some numbers in front of you, and now I'll show you. Oh no, I'm terrible at maths. I can't do it. Oh, I'm hopeless. Oh, no. Now, could you do that for me? Good, well done. And children will adopt patterns of thought that are modelled for them very, very quickly. Personality as well. This is just an interesting, there's a narcissistic personality. We all have narcissism to a greater or lesser extent, but it can be really pretty extreme. And so there's narcissist, it's so totally self-absorbed. But this is an interesting study. It came out at the end of last year, the first one that's actually been able to document it, but this was university students, but the more they engaged with visual forms of social media, the more narcissistic they became. Constant reference to themselves and how I look and how am I all right, how do I compare with others, constant self-absorption, or self-infatuation, I suppose you might say. So the mindful revolution, there's a lot of interest in it these days. You could say it's a meta skill that underpins a lot of other skills. There's a lot of research around about it. This is the number of studies published each year in peer-reviewed scientific journals on mindfulness. 2016, there were 667 new papers. Last year, if you ever use PubMed, there were 1,210 papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals on mindfulness last year alone. Right? It is going absolutely out of the park. Now, but mind you, the things that mindfulness teaches are not a new idea. Yes, absolutely. What did the ancients have to say about this? Even, I suppose, more modern-day sages, if you like. So Viktor Frankl, incredibly inspirational man, but between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Incredibly insightful. Because if we're an automatic pilot just going about in habitual mode while the mind's distracted somewhere else, there's a stimulus and a response before we even know where we are. We don't get to choose, we just react in the way we're habituated to reacting. It could be angry, it could be this, could be that. But you could say, well, that's our personality. We would say, oh, well, that's just me, I'm just like that, as if there's no other possibility. But we have to have awareness in the moment that the reaction's happening, to even realise, whoa, that's interesting, that's homicidal rage, just notice that, oh, that's interesting, I'll just stand a step or two back from that. And there's the window of opportunity to choose. Now, Viktor Frankl wasn't using the word mindfulness, but boy, is he describing the essential elements of it very well. Default mental activity, there's a lot of this default mode in states like anxiety and stress and depression and so on. We just give it names like worry, rumination, negative self-talk. So there's a lot of that in those conditions. So, and what we know is that when a person's sitting down and practicing mindfulness, the mind wanders off into a daydream, as it has a want to do. As soon as the person notices and brings their attention back to the present moment through the body, the breath, whatever the person's focusing on, the default circuits switch off again. The brain becomes quiet again, right? And what's interesting is if a person practices over time, then even when the mind goes into its habitual modes of negative self-talk and criticism and whatever else it might be doing, then areas of the brain associated with self-monitoring and cognitive control switch on much more quickly. So within a week, in a month, in a year, you will notice much more quickly, oh, there's that pattern of thought again. That's the self-awareness or self-monitoring. Oh, there's the negative self-talk again. There's the getting ahead of myself kind of thing that I habitually do. The cognitive control means you've got an ability to choose to give your attention to that or to leave that alone, to come back to what you're doing. You might be giving a presentation and you wander into worry about how's it going to go and what if it doesn't go well, and you notice, oh, there it is again, there's worry. Just bring my attention back to what I'm doing to prepare for the presentation. So attention back in the moment on task and away from the habitual forms of worry. So the brain will actually wire itself for better. That's why one of the reasons why it's so therapeutic for depression. The relaxation response, this is from Harvard, this particular study. So Herbert Benson, who coined the term the relaxation response, one of the early studies they did on epigenetics over 10 years ago. And they found the very first time a person sits down to practice an exercise like mindfulness, so, 20 minutes of sitting down, practicing being aware, etc., then the genes, the DNA that regulate the stress response, right, start to change their expression. The very first time a person practices that. So it's like turning down the volume on a genetic level on the stress response, right? But it very quickly goes back to where it was before, unless the person practices again and again and again and again, in which case those genes, the DNA gets down-regulated. If you like, the volume of the stress response starts to switch down. So now there are review papers on all of this. This is another public library of science. That's one of the world's biggest medical journals. And 2 minutes to go. Good. So emotional exhaustion, stress, psychological distress. So there's a whole range of things for which mindfulness-based approaches like MBSR have been found to be effective for. Improvements in mindfulness, personal accomplishment, so the person feels more engaged in their life, self-compassion. So we cultivate a bit of self-compassion. Most of us will habituate ourselves to self-criticism. A little bit of self-compassion is a very good foundation upon which to build compassion for others as well. Much better sleep and relaxation. This is an interesting study just on young people. MBSR again, so less anxious, less depressed, less physical symptoms associated with the stress, etc. Now, just an interesting little study to emphasise another point. What we practice, we will get good at, for better or for worse. This was a study looking at anticipation, the effect that anticipation has in our response to stressors, like public speaking. Anybody here afraid of public speaking? Along with me, all right? Good. Only a few of you. Oh, come on, surely not. Anyway, so you put people in stressful situations, and then they looked at how much they reacted, how much cortisol and stress chemicals they used to deal with that. But then they followed them up and did those tests a few more times. So one group who had a big spikes in cortisol and adrenaline and so on in response to stress, when they did it again, they had even bigger spikes than they were before. So they're even more anxious, anticipating, oh no, it was bad last time, it's going to be awful next time. And next time, it's going to be the end of my life, I can't stand it. But if they taught the people, I'll just go to the bottom line, if they taught the group to manage their stress, like techniques like we're talking about with mindfulness, then what happened was at each time the stress response was less. All right? I cannot tell you how much I've had to work with this, speaking a lot in public as I do, but my biggest fear in life is public speaking. So to actually be comfortable with that stress response, to be less reactive, not fight it, but just learn to sort of ride it, it gets easier to do it. And I've certainly had to do a lot of work on that myself. And then there's research on personality disorders, for example. So various mindfulness-based approaches like DBT, dialectic behaviour therapy, used for borderline personality disorders, and those disorders bite a lot less. That is, it interferes with the person's life a whole lot less. So I guess just in summary, what are we doing when we practice mindfulness? Well, this is Plato's 3 aspects of the psyche, represented in this bit of Platonic art, and by Pallas and the Centaur. She's the goddess of wisdom. She represents the highest aspect of the human psyche. The Centaur represents the 2 lower aspects, so the emotive and the appetitive element. And there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not meant to rule. We're meant to be ruled by the highest aspect of our psyche. And she's giving his prefrontal cortex of his brain a little bit of a massage there, because that's what he really needs to kick in for it. So in many ways, so human behaviour, and mind you, modern neuroscience just uses different language. Executive functioning, limbic system of the brain, mesolimbic reward system. It's just this, what Plato described 2,500 years ago, but we've just got a bit of science behind it now because he described it very well. So if we get those things aligned, then we're much more happy and healthy. All right, so Mr. Osborne, may I be excused? My brain is full. All right, so I think that's probably about time for me to finish. But the bottom line is an optimistic message. There's a lot we can do. We don't have to be prisoners of our so-called personality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. I think it's absolutely fabulous that we've got such very knowledgeable and developed individuals sharing with us and prodding us for introspection and thinking further about our own lives as such. I note that in the literature there is a dualistic use of terminology of non-linear thinking and central executive mode. And the non-linear thinking refers to the kind of mind processes that take place if you're lying on the beach on the sand and allowing a stream of free thoughts to enter, and sometimes perhaps wondering, where do these thoughts come from? And the central executive mode is when you're very task-oriented and need to be very focused as such. In the Jewish spiritual teachings, they are underscored by the terms of chokhmah and binah, as some of us will continue over the next several weeks understanding. Chokhmah is the creative facet of the brain that allows thoughts to pop into your head through some unknown mechanism, which Western psychology conveniently calls the subconscious, but we don't know much about that either. And the other format uses the central executive mode in order to be able to task orient. The interesting one is the third one of the triad in Jewish teachings, and that's da'at. And da'at would be the equivalent of the contemporary mindfulness. And that would mean taking the initial creative thought, allowing the second stage of binah, which means the elasticity of allowing it to have dimension, breadth, length, or what you would call analysis, and then getting back to what is it all for? What's the goal? What am I doing at this very moment? What am I perceiving? Where is it heading? That's da'at, which in many ways is the mindfulness of today. So when Craig noted towards the end there that really what we're doing in science very successfully is uncovering some of the truths that the ancients always proposed, that holds very, very true in our tradition. Our next speaker is Dr.Vicki Herzog-Gordon. I've had the very good fortune to know Vicki from her childhood onwards and have watched a young teenager mature into one of the most important catalysts within our community as such in many, many respects. And therefore I'm very, very proud to introduce her. She's a clinical and forensic psychologist working in private practice and in the Children's Court Clinic for over 20 years. Her PhD was in the experience of hidden child survivors of the Holocaust. She's going to raise the issue, which is the classic issue of nature-nurture, which one is the dominant, but also, interestingly and significantly for us as a Jewish people, the epigenetics of how trauma may or may not be passed through genetically to a future generation. In other words, am I, a child of Holocaust survivors, simply reliving things by empathy, by sympathy, or in fact have I genetically got something from my parents which make me a little more traumatically oriented than the average individual? But I'll leave it to Vicki to share some of that with us. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to return the compliment to Laibl, because I have known him since I was a teenager, and as a teenager he was a very influential person in my life then. And it's continued, and we happen to be neighbours now, although we see very little of each other except for waving in the street. It's been a long history. So yes, I'm going to look at the nature-nurture discussion through the lens of trauma. And whenever I speak about trauma, I begin by saying that trauma affects people in different ways, and I obviously don't know anyone in this room that might have experienced trauma. And if anything I say is triggering in any shape or form, please feel comfortable to just, do whatever you need to do to self-regulate, breathe slowly, leave the room, or anything like that, because it can stir it up. So I'm going to discuss complex subject matter, just give you a sort of thumbnail sketch, and start with the joke. Darwin and Freud walked into the bar. There were two little alcoholic mice drinking there. And I couldn't find a cartoon for that at all. Mother and son, they were drinking vodka from little thimbles. The mother looks up and says to Darwin and Freud, "Tell me, geniuses, how did my son get into this state?" "Bad inheritance," says Darwin. "Bad mothering," says Freud. So which one is it? So in the late 90s, the psychology literature began to look at the effects of neglect in childhood and the neurodevelopment of brains in neglected children. Bruce Perry was one of the psychiatrists in this area that looked at neglected children, and he came up with this slide. This was probably 1995 or 96, and that slide has always stayed with me. He looked at the brains of 3-year-old children. One was a normal child, and this one of extreme neglect was a 3-year-old child brought up in an orphanage in Romania that had very little touch, was living most of its day in a cot, had no contact with parents or caregivers of any sort. The brain is much smaller, as you can see, and the darker shades are the cortex area that were affected. So neglect or childhood abuse affects, actually, as Craig was saying, shrinks the brain and has a profound effect on the brain before the child's even born. Oh, well, this is 3 years postnatal, but as I will come to it later on when in utero. So we know from this, which is nearly 2 decades ago, more than 2 decades ago, that stress is bad for the developing brain. So how do we measure this? How do we prevent it? Not just observe it, but how do we prevent it, or how do we deal with it? So in the mid-90s, there was a huge study in the United States called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, which is known as the ACE study. So they interviewed about 17,500 adults, asking them about their children. And they asked about their history of exposure to negative experiences when they were children. So it's 10 questions on a sheet, and they were divided into 3 areas. One was actual abuse, neglect, or general household dysfunction. So let's say in the first one, physical abuse, it could be, the question is, did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or injured? And you just answer yes or no. Neglect question is in the emotional area. Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you, or that you thought you were important or special? Or did you feel that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? And the household dysfunction category covered areas like substance abuse, mental illness, criminal, did a household member go to prison, violence, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? It's interesting they use the word mother. Like I think now we would say parent, not just keep it to mothers that are the victims. Ever repeatedly hit over a few minutes or threatened with a knife or gun. So it was pretty simple questions, and you ended up with an ACE score. For every yes that you gave to one of those questions, you'd get 1 point on the ACE score. And they then correlated these ACE scores with health outcomes. So the first thing they found was ACEs are incredibly common. 70% of the population of these 18,000 people had at least one ACE score. And if you look at it for yourself, you probably think, yeah, you know, you could easily get 1 or 2 ACE scores in your family. But when we start going to the higher numbers, it changes. So 12% had 4 or more ACE scores. So the higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcome for a person. For a person with someone with an ACE score, and not just in psychological or mental well-being, that's the point I want to make here, that someone with an ACE score of 4 or more were 2.5 times more likely to get chronic obstruction, pulmonary disease, or hepatitis. For depression, if you had 4 or more, you were 4 times more likely to have depression. If you had 4 or more, you were 12 times more likely than the average person to be suicidal. For a person with a higher ACE score of, let's say, 7 out of 10, you triple the lifetime risk of lung disease. Now, who would put lung disease with childhood neglect? Or 3.5 times more at risk for coronary heart disease. Okay, so we know then that it's not just our genetics that put us in good stead for a healthy life, but it's also the influences and the experiences that we have, particularly as young children. So our brains are sculpted by our early experiences. They're actually shaped and formed, and like Craig was saying, we used to think it was brain was fixed at the age of 16. Certainly when I went through psychology, that's what we were taught. And now we know the neuroplasticity of the brain can adapt and change. But the first few years is when the brain's development is most vulnerable. And childhood abuse, therefore, is not something we should just get over, but we actually have to understand how it shapes and projects our personality and our life. So we know that the diseases in adulthood are actually fertilised by our early experiences of abuse or neglect in our childhood. So maybe as a society, we need to focus more on our children and protecting and preventing these sort of things than at the other end of our criminals and try and rehabilitate them. Maybe we need to be more proactive and less reactive and need to focus on the risk factors that influence the ACE scores. Martin Teicher took this even further, and in recent research he's looked at the gender differences between female brains and male brains and found that there's different points of vulnerability between girls and boys. So he says if we know that, then we should increase the support we give to maybe not for girls that I can't remember the dates, but it was like at 9 months of age and boys were at 15 months of age. Let's introduce supports that we need through the creches, through the childminding centres at those particular critical times. He does give the rider saying there is no good age to abuse a child, but he says we should be mindful that there are critical points for each of them. So we know that our brains, once we're born, are sculpted by experiences, good and bad. But what about the brain of an embryo, as Craig alluded to, and the fields of epigenetics? So can your grandmother's experience leave a mark on your genes? And this is a new field in the last decade or so, asking, well, can you get PTSD from your ancestors? And this brings us to the work of Moshe Ziff. And actually, the person that wrote that joke was interviewing or talking about the Moshe Ziff, and he says, and actually, as it happened, I took Moshe Ziff out to a bar, and because he's Jewish and Orthodox, we had to go to a bar that had, non-meat, and so that he carried the theme of the joke right through. Moshe Ziff and Rachel Yehuda, and they both work in the States, and they both work in this field of epigenetics. So epigenetics looks at what happens to the baby in utero, and can the mother's experience in utero affect the child and how the child will be born, and affect the brain of a child and the predisposition of a child to PTSD or other illnesses. They explored the idea that the children of traumatised parents are at risk for similar problems as their mothers was, due to their experiences of their mothers. Now, this is particularly, Rachel Yehuda looked at Holocaust and the transmission of trauma. And we talk about the transmission of trauma and the intergenerational transmission of trauma when we talk about our Holocaust legacy. But this is actually saying this actually happens in utero. And she looked at the cortisol levels, as was mentioned before, and it's intergenerationally transmitted across the membranes. So we're not just talking about what was conveyed in, once you're born and you sit around the table and hear stories, but you were actually talking about what was conveyed, what was transformed or transmitted during pregnancy. She also looked at pregnant women, interestingly, in 9/11 that were pregnant and that were working in the building, and then followed up afterwards, and found and measured the cortisol levels. And it's quite complex because there's actually a lower level of cortisol in these children that are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, which is sort of counterintuitive, but she gets down to really specifics, which I won't go into. Okay, so basically the new insights of behavioural epigenetics and traumatic experiences in our past, or in our ancestors' past, are leaving molecular scars that adhere to our DNA, to our genes. Jews whose parents went through the Holocaust, Jews whose great-grandparents may have fled from their shtetls in Russia, children whose grandparents may have lived through the ravages of the Cultural Revolution, young immigrants from Africa that we see a lot here, who may have survived massacres, and adults of every ethnicity who grew up with alcoholic or abusive parents, all carry with them more than just memories. So I think of it like silts deposited on cogs of a machine. Like after the tsunami, you're left with this fine layer of silt on everything. So that's like what's transmitted. We've got our DNA, we've got our machinery, we've got our gene, and then there's this layer of silts that's overlaid on it all. It's like a molecular residue holding fast to our genetic scaffolding. So we have the DNA is the same, the genetic structure is the same. We're all familiar with that picture. But the psychological and behavioural tendencies are then inherited or overlaid onto the genes. So you may have inherited more than your grandmother's nose. You may also inherit her disposition to depression, which appeared in her because of the neglect she suffered in her childhood. And like I said, we don't have to look far back in our generations to think of our Holocaust parents and grandparents that went through that. Or not. It's not all doom and gloom. If your grandmother was adopted by nurturing parents, you might be enjoying the boost she received and the repair in her relationships that she received by their love and support. And I think it's important to remember that the mechanisms of epigenetics is not just underlying deficits and weaknesses or vulnerabilities in us all, but also strength and resilience. So like you inherit your grandmother's vintage dress, you can have it altered and change things. So I think I'm going to be the only one that's going to finish in time because Nathan scared me that Laibl's going to ring a bell. So the genome is known as the blueprint of our life, but the epigenome is life's etch-a-sketch. And if you shake it hard enough, you can clean the slate and alter the map of life. Finished in time.
Thank you very much, Vicki. That was really illuminating. We're going to pause. You're going to get up. You're going to stretch. And some very wonderful volunteers are going to share with you a smoothie, very healthy and very tasty, which my wife Leah designed, and you'll be able to give her feedback. So get up for 5 minutes and stretch. If you want to know what's in those drinks, here is the explanation.
Hello, everybody. The drink is made up of cantaloupe, honeydew, honey, coconut water, coconut cream, and that's the drink. Oh, banana. One banana. Yes.
Before I introduce our next presenter, can I just momentarily address the thematic subject matter, which is, of course, the basic question of whether we can change or not, because we've had a lot of discussion so far telling us why we are the way we are, but do we have the capacity to consciously, in a directed fashion, undo and change? Now, this has been hinted at a number of times. Thank you for the SOS has gone out, and we've got 3 cups coming here. Thank you. I'm going to have to go to the bathroom soon. Okay. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was very often quoted with the maxim, Shinui HaTeva, that the aim of mastery in life is to change our very nature. It's a sine qua non in Judaism that we have the capacity to undo every aspect of our personality. This is a rather bold and strong statement, and over the next 4 weeks, as Menachem and I pursue a course indicating some of the techniques, mechanisms, and Jewish understandings of the way we are, you'll see that perhaps there is the promise of creating that change. If we want to look at those default faults or default behaviors that we somehow automatically do that we don't like. I'm told that there are 37 trillion chemical processes taking place every second in our body. That's a lot of processes, and they're orderly, which makes it even very more remarkable. But what's more remarkable is that every time that you practice a mindful moment, you are, whoever the you is, and that's a nice deep question, able to orchestrate all those 37 trillion processes. Now that's really fascinating, that there is a profound I that is able to harness the automatic workings of the brain towards an end or a goal. If only we practiced sufficiently in order to do so and change moods, emotional dispositions, negative interpersonal habits, and the like, wouldn't the world be a much better place? Our next presenter is again someone whom I've known for some decades. I've had the good fortune, having now reached early middle age, to have had time to learn from many, many people. Nathan Kotler is one such individual, an individual who has gone through himself challenging moments in his life, has been a wonderful friend and counselor to many, and we have the good fortune of having him this evening for the first time. Nathan is a psychologist, a family therapist in private practice in Windsor. He specializes in the areas of relationships, collaborative practice which helps both partners achieve their interests while divorcing, loss and grief, chronic and life-threatening illnesses including psycho-oncology, which helps those diagnosed with cancer and their carers, recovery from the effects of traumatic experiences and memories, and addictions. Tonight, Nathan will be talking about how culture and environment leaves their mark on parts of our personality and what we can do about it. We all talk about our parts. Some of you may have a part that wanted to come here tonight, while at the same time another part wanted possibly to stay home and watch Netflix. Yet you came. Others didn't. Nathan believes the greater understanding of our parts gives us a greater understanding of our personality. I invite you to listen to Nathan Kotler.
Okay, my job is to discuss personality in 15 minutes using the old line, I've got to stand on one foot. First of all, I'm not going to be defining personality tonight. We all know something about what that word means and how our personalities are different from other people's. And as Vicki and Craig have explained, our personality is not controlled by our genes. It is moulded by our culture and environment. This 15-minute talk is a general overview of the development of our personality. At birth, we are a clean slate. The only awareness we have is of internal physical feelings: hunger, wetness, heat, cold, etc. We are content when our physical needs are met. When they are not met, we are anxiety, which is the energy for fight or flight, or we are anger, the energy that tries to create change. If our physical needs are not met often enough, we also are loss or abandonment. We become the feelings. We are content, angry, etc. We are not aware that it is a feeling that's part of us. We are incapable of just noticing. When very young, we need our primary caregivers to help us manage our distressing states of anger, anxiety, loss, abandonment, etc. through the way they care for us. If they are unable to help us for a variety of reasons, we then need to find our own ways of managing our distressing states. We begin to develop ways of protecting ourselves by developing internal protectors. These protectors initially determine our personality. As adults, our protectors can take on many forms, all designed to minimize the emotional pain we feel in our hurt child parts. These hurting parts are called exiles. These exile parts have felt shamed, neglected, abused, or hurt in a variety of ways during childhood. These painful emotions result from our reactions to our culture and/or our environment. The exile parts are subsequently banished by the protectors for their own safety and to keep them from overwhelming our internal system with emotional pain. A great deal of internal energy is expended to keep the exiles out of awareness. There are two types of protectors, proactive and reactive. The proactive parts, called managers, help us with our day-to-day functioning. They help us learn, work, and be prepared. Managers are vigilant and anxious in trying to help exiles from being triggered and flooding the system with emotion. And the way they help us is by being critical, perfectionist, avoiding times of feeling alone, and also to help us feel unmotivated, etc. I'll give an example later. The other type of protectors are reactive, and these are called firefighters. These are the emergency response workers that activate after we are triggered and start to become flooded. These protectors very anxiously push us to binge eat, to drink, self-medicate, do extreme exercise, extreme internet use, etc., etc. For example, some of us need to be perfect. This manager part helps us to avoid feelings of being worthless. In general, our expectations can act as managers because they make us feel bad for not achieving as expected. It's less distressing to have bad feelings about oneself than to feel worthless and scared of further abandonment. It is less distressing to feel angry with a loved one for not meeting our expectations than to feel that they don't care about us and they might abandon us. Another example. There are times when an important person in our lives attacks us verbally. We can be flooded by feelings of shame or worthlessness or self-hatred. This is when a firefighter steps in and gets us to want to comfort eat, to drink alcohol, go on the attack, or just run out of the room. Tonight we have listened to previous speakers. Dr. Debbie and Dr. Craig subtly suggested actions for us to take on. A part of each of us may want to take on their suggestions, and a part of us may not. The internal conflict results in us feeling unmotivated. That second part that doesn't want to may be a manager part that wants to protect a hurt child exile that fears another failure. Some of us may be starting to feel overwhelmed by all they have heard tonight. You may just notice that you are feeling like a smoke, or thinking of going with a friend to have a drink, or you may be thinking about that Netflix series you're missing out on. What you're experiencing is a firefighter that is trying to distract you to stop you feeling overwhelmed and inadequate. As I talk, what parts are you aware of right here, right now in this moment? Just notice them for a minute before I go on. I'm not expecting anyone to talk. I'm just giving you a chance just to notice yourself. Understanding our parts help us understand our personality. When we just notice ourselves, we can notice that we are often anxious. We are often in flight or fight mode, which impacts on our body in many negative ways, as was alluded to earlier. In that moment, we have become aware of the anxiety of our protectors. One important question: how do we better deal with our protectors? Our parts are trying to help us, but can work in ways that don't suit us anymore. Changing the way our parts operate require what Laibl was starting to talk about. I'm taking you up on that. Changing the way our parts operate requires the help of our higher self, self with a capital S. The higher self is the you that is not a part. It is the you that just notices. This is the place in our inner system from which we can observe our parts. From this place we can see ourselves and others through the compassionate eyes of non-judgment. We observe our parts but are taken over by them. For example, instead of being angry, we notice we are angry. The ability to just notice, which is an ability of our higher self, is essential to becoming aware and to grow. We can connect to our higher self by meditating, praying, or being mindful in other ways. I now invite you to do a meditation to access your higher self. If you feel comfortable to do so, gently close your eyes. If not, find a spot on the floor, the wall, anywhere just to look at. Adjust your seating so that you feel comfortable. Notice any tension in different parts of your body and relax those parts of your body. Take a slow breath in through your nose and gently let it out through your nose. As you repeat this, be aware that in this moment there is nothing else you need to do in this moment. Let your breath move slowly in and slowly out. You may like to notice how the breath feels as it goes in and out of your body. In and out of your body. Just notice. You can also let your parts know that there is nowhere else you need to be in this moment, except here and now and breathing. That's all you need to do now. In another moment we may do something else, but in this moment, in the present, you are just slowly breathing in and breathing out. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do. As you are doing this, invite your parts to give yourself more space inside, to allow you to feel the calmness that you are as you slowly breathe in and breathe out. Just notice. As you are doing that, you may be aware of voices or feelings or sensations. Those are your parts. Just notice them. Let your parts know that they will be attended to, but in this moment, you are just breathing in more self-energy. Ask the parts to give you a bit more space and continue slowly breathing in and out. As you do that, you may notice that this is becoming effortless as you breathe in and out. You may also notice that in this moment, there is more calm available in your system. Now, in this moment, let your parts know that you are now available to them. See which parts have the most pressing needs for your attention right now. Pick one. Just notice what this part is saying, feeling, or wanting you to do. Thank the part for wanting you to do something, and then tell them that you will continue this dialogue later. Just notice any response from the part. Now, take 3 more slow breaths in and out. In and out. In and out. And then slowly open your eyes and come back to the room. Our higher self does not operate on the anxiety that our managers and firefighters do. The qualities of the self are calmness, curiosity, confidence, courage, clarity, creativity, connection, and most important of all, compassion. Therefore, the more we are in the higher self, the more we can manage our parts and better manage our responses to the parts of others. For years, we operate on automatic pilot and exhibit a certain personality, a personality based on anxiety. We can then reach a stage when we realize that we are unhappy with our internal operating system. Our self has noticed many unhappy, anxious parts. This is when we can begin the process of choosing to do things to change our personality. We can change the ways our protectors work, and we can heal our wounded, hurting child parts. We then function more in calm self mode rather than anxious protector mode. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. Thank you.
Didn't even allow me to ring the bell.
I'm more obsessive.
But I wasn't going to argue with his iPhone. It's interesting, change, because nothing is still. Everything's in a constant state of motion. And as I often use the metaphor and imagery, you and I are surfers, surfing the waves of change. And if you and I can become well-balanced and in sync with the energy of the wave of this moment, then we can ride the wave to shore, the shore of that moment. But for each one of us to do that, sometimes we have to become more adept at surfing. And in so doing lies a process. In Judaism, I guess we tend to favor the behavioral approach. When we were at Mount Sinai all together, some of you might recall. No? Short-term memory, I know. We said 2 words, na'aseh v'nishma. We will act, we will behave, we will do, and then we'll study and try to understand. Somewhere through the very act of the doing comes an inner understanding. If I were to teach a class of non-swimmers through a PowerPoint presentation and be able in the space of an hour to get the individuals in the room to do all the strokes masterfully in their seat and give them a certificate, this would be no guarantee that they wouldn't drown. Somehow being in the water makes all the difference. Living life makes all the difference. The doing things of life creates change. We change from the outside in, not necessarily from the inside out. That's a very Jewish approach. Our next presenter is someone whom I've known actually all his life. He's a fascinating individual, I've got to tell you. My wife and I often think about it. And he has achieved a tremendous amount in a short life so far, as many of you realize. Whilst being the bane of all teachers at Yeshiva College, who pronounced very earnestly he'll amount to nothing, he nevertheless went on and studied in the rabbinical colleges, both here and overseas, and served in the community of Leeds, England, for a year, which is the normative process for a rabbinical student in the Chabad tradition to travel and serve a community somewhere in the world. Then he went and became, for a number of months, actually 6 months, a scholar and teacher at a yeshiva in Israel. Came back, decided it's time to marry with a bit of coaxing from Leah and myself, and married the girl next door, in fact, very close there too. Then went back to South Africa, where he actually did his rabbinical studies initially and completed post-rabbinical studies. And since then went on to be a co-developer and founder of Spiritgrow right here. I'm very proud to have Rabbi Menachem Wolf address us and tell us a little bit about where does our spiritual self impact our personality.
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our family therapy session this evening. At least someone's getting his money's worth tonight. Before I start, I just want to put out a few big thank yous to some of the people who have helped make tonight such a success. You were greeted by 3 fantastic people. You may have thought they were employees of Spiritgrow, but they're not. They're dedicated volunteers. And they are Roz, Anne, and Lolly. And I'd just like to give them a big round of applause because they made personal... Actually, one of them made a very large sacrifice to be able to volunteer tonight. And just that giving, that constant giving by the 3 of you to make programs here work so smoothly. I'd also like to give a big thanks to David Rothberg, who volunteers to video every program, edit, and whack them online in due course. Well, there you are. And we like to have that delay because if we do it straight away, people just won't come because they know they can watch it the next night. So you can hear this year's research next year. So, and just go to the YouTube Spiritgrow channel. It's all there. I'm going to film my 18 minutes doing this promo, by the way. This is a late night infomercial. I don't know what you thought you were coming to. Last but not least, I want to thank my parents have really done a lot of the back work to make tonight happen together with the admin team at Spiritgrow. So a very big thank you for putting tonight together. Of course, we'll acknowledge the speakers, but I'll allow my father to give a proper vote of thanks at the end. So in my father's lifelong report about what I've done, he mentioned that I did learn overseas. And when I was overseas, there was a famous story, and everyone reckons they know who the story was about, but it's impossible that it was. I don't even know if the story ever really happened. But the story goes that a student walked into the rabbinical college study hall wearing jeans and a t-shirt, not exactly rabbinic attire, and the head rabbi of the academy raised his head. There was no response. He raised his eyebrow, and finally the response came. And the student kind of guiltily walked up to the desk and said, "Look, I'm sick of putting on a show, and I'd like Toche Kabare. I'd like my insides and my outsides to be aligned. This is who I really am. Who am I fooling? This is what I am. I don't want to be a liar. So the dean looks at him and says, Tocha Gabare, you want your insides and outsides to be aligned? It's not a big kunz. It's not that heroic. But to align your inside with what you're trying to be on the outside, now that's a great achievement. And that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. How do we change our inside? Is by changing our outside. Who we are and what we are is often described by what we wear and the persona that we put on. So I'm a young father, as in I'm young and I am a father. I have 4 kids and they range between 3 and 11 years old. And anyone that's been in my position knows what it's like to be in a shopping centre, a supermarket, particularly at the checkout line with 1 or 2 kids. And one of them starts speaking inappropriately. They usually tend to pull out these fantastic racist remarks rather innocently when you really, I've got my tzitzis, my yarmulke, and all that goes through my head is, damn it. Everyone's going to think that the Jews talk racist at home and the kids are just revealing what we talk about at the dinner table. And it's just not true. But kids find this uncanny ability to share the most awkward thoughts when they are with their parents in public. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, wow, I'm impressed. But my kids do this to me all the time. I told you this was family therapy. And so there's this thought that goes through your head, or goes through my head, and that is, how am I going to publicly defend myself without anyone thinking that I'm really defending myself? I know I'll talk slightly louder than is normal to my child, in more complex words than they understand, and because I'm talking to the child, hopefully everyone else that hears this racist remark will hear what I'm saying and realize that really Jews are fantastic people. And so I'll turn to my 3-year-old daughter, Bella, it's not really racist as much as the sort of things commenting about people's skin color really loud and pointing. No, to that lady over there. Look, you're not looking, and pointing out what I'm meant to be looking at. And so what I will do to my 3-year-old daughter Bella is, at the top of my lungs, in a very hushed top of my lungs, I'll say, Bella, it's really inappropriate to be pointing out the differences between people because really inside we're all the same, aren't we? And go on some sort of rant about equality and who knows what. And she's just looking at me, oh, can we get those ice creams? And so my whole daddying is putting on this piece of clothing, which I really have only put on for the other person. It's not really who I am. But internally, I've taken on this whole persona. I've become this defensive individual. And so I now assume that this person's going to look at me as a terrible parent who speaks all sorts of negative things about people who look different to my daughter. And I'm just living this whole internal life, this whole battle in my head, according to this garment that I've put on. I'm being defined by what I think everyone else thinks of me. And that doesn't just go away. Then you mull all the way to the car. Do they still think that of me? Am I still like that? And you've got these voices, and Nathan spoke a bit about the voices in our head, and I had a great teacher that said, only crazy people don't have voices in their head. And so you have all these voices in your head that go chattering. And these are layers. We've got all sorts of layers. These are garments. And I'm going to give the word garments its correct Hebrew term, which is levushim. Levushim are clothing, garments. And you put on different levushim for different occasions, and you become that. You put on leather-soled shoes, and you feel different. If you're like me and you like to put on high heels from time to time, you feel different. You know? And depending on what you're wearing will make you feel a certain way. You walk around like a shloch, you're going to present like a shloch. You walk around shlumpy, you're going to walk around, you're going to come across as a bit of a zlob. And if you don't speak Yiddish, I think you know what I'm talking about, don't you? You don't have to watch Seinfeld to know what I'm on about here. So these levushim, these garments define us. In Kabbalah, levushim are a bit more complex than the shirts, pants, and shoes that we wear. They are the many layers that coat the soul. There are the 10 Sfirot, which I'm not really going to elaborate on tonight because we're going to save that for the series. The 10 Sfirot are different personality aspects that are a part of who we are. And different conditions in our life, different experiences, will cause certain Sfirot to become more dominant and other Sfirot to be less dominant. And basically the experiences that we go through will begin to elicit a response that one might say is my nature. But because that is your nature, does not mean that you can't change your nature, can't change what you are. Now these Sfirot are not levushim that can be changed. You can't change. Everyone has these 10 energies to who they are, but what we can is modulate how dominant each one is. The main levushim that we do wear are thoughts, speech, and action. None of the thoughts that you have are thoughts that you have to have. And none of the things that you say are things that you have to say. And none of the things that you do are things that you have to do. We choose the thoughts that we want to think about. We choose the words that we use. And we choose the actions that we partake in. And you might say, no, that's not completely true. I do things rather instinctively. And I'm here tonight to argue that is a choice. That is a choice. And I'll give you the best example. Forget words. Who here has ever stifled a sneeze because someone was too close to them? I mean, that's nature. You can't stifle a sneeze. When that thing has to come out at 60 miles an hour, it's coming. You try stopping a car at 60 miles, you can't do it. And yet with sneezes, you go, you manage to do that. And if you can just video someone, you'll see all the facial expressions. It's like, there's a lot happening there. Or if you're in front of someone and you have to stifle a yawn. Now, you know it's because they're so boring that you're yawning. But you don't want them to feel bad. But it's nature. I need to let it out. No, so you go, right? Why? It's nature. It's part of who you are. But if you really put your mind to it, you can stop the yawn. You can stop the sneeze. Which is what we tell our kids. Again, the young father metaphor. Don't burp. Don't farts. Don't do this at the table. And what do the kids all say? I couldn't control it. Couldn't control it. It had to come out. And what do we say? Yes, you can. The person who says, I can't control my thoughts, I can't control my actions, and telling my kids, you don't do that at the table. What you do is you suck it in or you drink some water. We've all got the tips how not to burp, but we're not really focusing on our own thoughts and our own bodily behaviors, the behaviors that we use to engage with other people. And why is that? Because we say we can't really control ourselves. It's my nature. I'm an angry person. I'm a sad person. I'm a violent person. I'm a happy person. I've got this. I've got that. Nonsense. That is what we do right now, but that is not who we are. Because the Kabbalah talks about this idea of mind, emotion, and impulse. In the Zohar, it talks about the unique design of the human. The human is an erect individual, Homo erectus. That's not a Kabbalistic term, by the way, in case you want to quote me on that. We are upright. In fact, if we're not upright, we should get that checked out because we're designed to have a straight back. We're designed to walk around with our head up, our emotions in the center, and our impulsive sensations lower down. Animals, same level. And therefore their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors are the same. You can't expect more of an animal than being an animal. But a person can crawl around on all fours, but we expect more of a person. And therefore the Zohar says we were designed to be upright, and therefore there is a hierarchy. Our gut and our impulse, our responses, which is where action comes from, are the things that should least govern us and the things that should be the most governed. Oh, but I just had to do it. If you just have to do something, You just have to work on gaining a level of control, which we'll talk more about during the 4-week series, but I'll talk about something tonight so that you don't just walk off with this infomercial, but something tachlis. Our emotions. Emotions in Kabbalah are not sadness and happiness. Emotions only come in 2 forms. Emotions that connect and emotions that put distance. Awe, reverence, fear, a distance, love, affection, a connection, closeness. And so in any situation, we will have an emotional response. I want to get closer, or I want to get further. Either I'm further because I'm feeling small, insignificant, in a state of awe, or I'm afraid, or I want to get closer because I want to see more of it, whatever it is. And so people say, well, I'm a very emotional person. I can't really control my emotions. And comes the Zohar and says, what are you talking about? You're a human. It starts up here. It starts with the consciousness of decision making. And just because we're not used to making decisions, particularly in the West, around our emotions and our impulsive responses, does not mean that you can say, that's my nature. That's not my nature. That's my nurture. That's what I've become. That's what I was taught to be. By the angry people around me, by the happy people around me, by the blasé people around me, by the violent people around me, by the placid people around me. I'm just mimicking. And mimicking that, and you can study the science of that, of what that does to the brain, but according to Kabbalah, you cannot accept that as a position that gets you through life. And therefore there is the demand of Ma'ach Shalat Al Alev, that the mind must always rule over the heart being our seat of emotions, and of course our gut being the seat of our impulse. And what we need to do is just slow things down. And tonight we've had a few techniques shared of how you can slow things down. Mindfulness, meditation, developing an awareness. Ooh, that sensation rising and me choosing not to act on it. Or I choose to allow it to be and therefore I'm not going to act on it. You can really break these stages down. And therefore when the Kabbalah says Ma'ach Shalat Al Alev and Hasidism turns that into a way of living, there's no excuse of that I can't. There is only the excuse of I don't want to. I emotionally am rebelling against this idea. It's too hard, I'm too old, I'm too busy. So you'll notice that Hasidism and Judaism in general isn't very much into rights-based living. It doesn't say, by the way, if you want, we suggest this is a good idea. Should we take a vote? You don't really get votes. You don't read the Torah and go, gee, Moses was a democratic character. You don't see God going, I told them to do this, but, you know, they have their way, I have mine. Golden calf, kids. No, there's always a good smiting. Every time you do something wrong, smite them. Smite them. Moses goes, please don't smite them. God says, I'm not consultative, but I'll take your opinion on board. You know, this sort of stuff. So when Kabbalah describes this and then Hasidism etches it into a way of living and says, we must live mind over emotion, it's not really a way if you want. It is the ultimate way for the Homo erectus, for the person who walks upright to be living. What are the benefits? Well, we've heard a whole lot of the benefits tonight. So how do I do it? So we must incorporate what we've learnt tonight. We must incorporate moments of mindfulness in the most generic way that you want to translate that word. Pausing, becoming aware, and then staying aware, and then moving on, and practicing that. And there are so many side benefits, as Dr. Craig Hassad mentioned tonight. All these other, well, for me, they're side benefits. They weren't side benefits for what he was talking about. But in what I'm talking about is you can become aware of the emotion and then not only ignore it or engage with it, but you can actually change it. Oh, I don't like this. Why not? Maybe I should. Let me learn to love. Let me learn to revere. Let me learn to control. I don't have to act on the impulse. And therefore, we don't follow our gut. We don't follow our heart. We follow our mind. And we use the value system and the education that we gain to regulate and decide which is the right emotion for this moment. What is the right impulse? And so instead of going through this massive process of self-transformation and meditation on mountains, just start living a bit more consciously. When you eat, when you're about to fall asleep, just, oh, I'm falling asleep, and then go. You're eating, oh, I'm hungry. Just start with these little steps. Change from the t-shirt and the jeans into the button-down shirt and the pants. You're not going to become a rabbi overnight. Trust me, I tried it. You don't pass a test looking good. But if you start these small baby steps of external steps, they will become your internal being. Thank you very much. I'll leave it.
You can make up your mind whether there's genetic continuity between myself and my son. Or has he worked so hard on himself to make sure he's not like me? Or is it me who's done the hard work? I'm not sure. Anyway, thank you very much, Menachem. Not only was that very, very important, but it was very entertaining at the same time. Tonight was the preview, if you like, of what we'd like to do over the subsequent 4 weeks from now on, in terms of working a bit harder in the way that Menachem mentioned, in terms of self-change in those areas where you want to exercise self-change. We've entitled the series Fire, Air, Earth and Water because this is the traditional fourfold mechanism of analyzing personality. Some people in this room are fire-oriented personalities. Some are water-oriented, earth-oriented, air-oriented. And we'll discuss what that means. The truth is we possess all four. But one is dominant, another one is subdominant, another one is sub-subdominant, and the fourth one sub-sub-subdominant. In the initial session next week, we're going to look at the templates of these four in context of yourself, your parents, your grandparents, and your children. And we're going to overlay some of the diagrams that we draw of those generations and see if there's a correlation or not. You'll have some very surprising results. We're going to, over the next several weeks, provide techniques and mechanisms experientially in terms of how to create that kind of change that we want. We're going to be looking at how to adopt masks as needed, but not as false statements of ourselves, but flexible expressions of different facets of ourselves. So you can look forward to a very, very interesting four-part series that Menachem and I are going to present. Tonight has been absolutely wonderful, and that's been only due to the presentations, the work, the effort that's gone through the four speakers' lives in order to make tonight as important as it is. And I want to thank you, Nathan, Vicki, Debbie, Gray, in having taken the time to able to make this what it is. Let me just say a final statement emphasizing a point that Menachem made. Levushim, garments, have spiritual garments, he said. They are thought, speech, and behavior. The Baal Shem Tov said, you are where your thoughts are. And all of us recognize that thoughts are perhaps the most difficult in order to master. Nevertheless, in our tradition, we learn that mastery of thoughts is not something that is possible, but each one of us must entertain that and practice it. We don't have to be successful 100%, but as we've heard earlier, the plasticity of the brain is such that we can become more and more successful. And since our thoughts dictate so many of the chemical processes of the body and therefore affect our health and well-being, the reason why we in Spiritgrow are undertaking the subject matter is because a number of mitzvot are being met, most notably health and wellness. You know full well that mind, body is very closely interrelated. The second one is the most fulfilling and happiness-oriented aspect of life is relationships. And to be able to be empathic, to be able to be compassionate, to be able to reflect what the other one is all about, requires us to assume often different internal persona. And therefore, all these factors are so terribly important in our development as a Jewish person and as a human being as a whole. I want to thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. I look forward to seeing you in the future weeks, and I want to wish you a very happy, mindful life.